All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks to those of you who are able to come today. I see a couple of familiar faces. And for those of you who are new, this is our workforce lecture series on evidence-based practice for children and youth. And we cover a variety of topics, generally in the fields of behavioral health, child welfare, and juvenile justice. So this year we have a lineup. However, next month we've had some issues with our speaker having to do a last-minute conference on the date she was supposed to be speaking here. So if you haven't seen an announcement for that yet, for those of you who are on the listserv, we'll be sending out something shortly that gives specific information about that topic. So be on the lookout for that. If you're not on our listserv, this would be a great opportunity to sign up so that you have a heads up on these topics and supplemental information from our speakers. So we do have a sign-in sheet there. We also have evaluations which really help us to figure out those lectures which have a lot of popularity so we can bring them back in the future. So it'd be great if you could complete one of those and just let us know how you feel about the topics that we are presenting on. Okay, so let's see. So the series itself will run from now, and we'll have monthly lectures until about May. And again, we will be sending out updated date information and speaker information. And if you have questions about today's lecture for the speakers, we're going to ask that you state them clearly, and then we're going to ask the speakers to actually paraphrase it so that we have everything recorded on the microphone. We tape all of the lectures, and we distribute it widely to people that are on our listserv throughout the state. So we would appreciate your patience with that as they do that. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's topic. So thanks very much to our speakers for getting over here and for Sarah Walker for putting this together. So these lectures are actually put on by the School of Social Work in collaboration with the School of Medicine and our Division of Public Behavioral Health and Justice Policy. So Dr. Sarah Walker is faculty there at the division, and she's going to moderate today. And so the title of today's lecture is Program Co-Design with Native American Communities, Examples from Healing of the Canoe and Aggression Replacement Training. So I'm going to go ahead and let her introduce our speakers, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming in today. I am a research assistant professor in psychiatry, and I have a strong interest in program development and adaptation and cultural responsivity in sort of along all the continuum of system responses to particularly youth involved in the justice system or kind of at risk of involvement in the justice system. And I am really honored and thrilled that the folks on our panel today agreed to come and talk. These individuals have the real lived experience of working in this area, working collaboratively in a participatory way with tribes around offending and substance abuse reduction programs and have a lot to tell us. So I want to get to them as quickly as possible and just sort of set up the context of this with a few of my own thoughts, which I'll take responsibility for and not blame them if I'm wrong or misinformed on any of this. So in particular, substance abuse kind of reduction, prevention, and offending reduction and prevention programs are fundamentally about the right way to live, aren't they? They're about how we interact with people. They're typically about encouraging youth to get back into school, to get jobs, sort of do things that our society values and thinks are worthwhile. So really fundamentally at the bottom, at the base of these programs is sort of a value judgment about the right way to live. And I think that that's important to keep in mind as we think about disseminating programs into different communities, into different places, that we're really having a conversation about values fundamentally. So traditionally, and still today, these kinds of messages around the right way to live and values are typically communicated through what, or supported through what? Does anybody want to throw out an idea? We'll do some early participation. If you think about how values are communicated to you in your life about the right way to live, they came through, what's that? Storytelling. Media. Yeah, family, possibly. for many people, their spiritual tradition and their culture through stories that get passed down and get reinforced around the right way to live. So particularly with, if any of you like sociologists or kind of are interested in the history of these things too, so urbanization has been a big factor now in how we address some of this stuff, with diversity of cultures and sort of maybe a breakdown of a single strong cultural sort of support or value for this. Programs that are more secular around the right way to live have emerged. And the people who came up with these programs, they came up with them because their own experiences with kids, you know, in these systems, they found that certain ways of doing things worked, and they wanted to share them with other people. Or there was a need that was identified, and they thought, well, let's try doing this, and they developed a program around it. And following the evidence-based, you know, movement in medicine, people started to package these. They started to test them. We've found that some approaches work generally well, and some approaches don't work so well. But we're still talking about ways, right living and values around right living. So I wanted to set it up that way because when we talk about implementation of these kind of packaged programs or other ways of communicating research into different communities and into different societies, I think it's really important to remember that when we are talking about these programs, we're often having a conversation about values. And with Native American communities specifically, which we're going to talk about today, their efforts to EBPs have been to implement evidence-based practices have been really challenging for a number of reasons, one of which is that there's ongoing distrust between a lot of tribal nations, the U.S. government, and researchers. To just give you an example, that this distrust is not unfounded. The Indian Health Services money that goes to support medical services in tribal nations is half that, typically, per person than is allocated for people accessing Medicaid. So, you know, youth growing up, particularly in tribal communities, are facing much higher rates of poverty, much higher rates of exposure to substance use issues. They're facing much higher rates of suicidality, and these are really real challenges that these communities are really right to think are being caused by the systems that now are saying, and we have a solution for you in this program. So clearly you can see where this complicates and is a very sensitive topic. And so I'm going to stop talking about it, and I'm going to be very pleased to now hand it over to Dr. Dennis Donovan, who is the director of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute in the Department of Psychiatry, who's, of course, a national, international expert on substance abuse treatment and intervention, and is the principal investigator for the Healing of the Canoe project, which is a long-standing collaboration with tribes in our state that he will describe, along with Robin Sigo, who is the principal investigator for the Suquamish Tribe for the Healing of the Canoe project, who is also a former director of their wellness program in the tribe and is actually a former graduate of the social work program here at the University of Washington. And after they talk a little bit of the Healing of the Canoe project, Rudy Nix, who is the tribal outreach liaison for the DSHS Juvenile Justice Rehabilitation Administration, is going to be talking about his efforts to collaborate with tribes around aggression replacement training, which is a specific evidence-based program which is funded through the state, and sort of some of the different forms that that's taken as he tries to support the use of that program. So.
Well, thank you. Robin and I are going to try to describe in a fairly brief period of time what has been an 11-year journey, and I'm losing my voice, by the way, so maybe Robin will describe more than me, of the Healing of the Canoe project, which is a project that began initially as a partnership between the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute here on campus and the Suquamish Tribe, and has since expanded to include as a primary partner the Port Gamble-Sklallam Tribe. And I'll show you in a moment on a slide sort of how close they are and yet how distant they are in many ways. Robin, do you want to say anything as we get started?
I'm good.
There you are. We're good at this. We do dog and pony shows. We just actually had a training the last 2 days, so bear with us as we go through slides, but if there are questions along the way, please feel free to ask. and Robin and I will sort of go from there. So the history of this really is one of a concern that was expressed by then the wellness director of the Suquamish Tribe, who came to a person who then was a postdoctoral research fellow with us at the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, Lisa Ray Thomas, who is an Alaska native, who lives on Bainbridge Island. And that's important geographically because Bainbridge Island is equidistant between Suquamish and the university. And literally and figuratively, she has been our go-between in this project. And the wellness director said, we're concerned because there's this issue of increased alcohol and drug use among our youth. And it would it be possible for the tribe and the university to work together collaboratively to develop some kind of a program that could address these concerns? An important part of that in this process, from a researcher's perspective, is that we were invited in. And that becomes a theme that we'll talk about over and over, the importance of asking permission to come ashore. We use lots of analogies and metaphors that we'll describe along the way. So as we began to work with the tribe to develop this response, we began with working with the tribal council and a community advisory group. At the very same time, simultaneously, what is now the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities had a call for proposals for research using community-based participatory research approaches. Not necessarily targeting Native communities, but in general, looking at communities that have issues of health disparities that could be addressed using this kind of an approach. CBPR is the abbreviation. We thought, well, why not apply? You know, this is a great opportunity. We're trying to do this work. It really is consistent with the principles of community-based participatory research, and we applied, and we were lucky enough and fortunate enough to be one of 25 grantees under the large umbrella of community-based participatory research, only 3 of which, including ours, targeted Native communities. So we really felt quite good and blessed about that. But as you can see here, we've been funded, we've been working collaboratively, we use CBPR, and it really is based on trying to use as preventive and curative factors tribal culture and values. We've been involved in 3 different phases of the study. The first phase was one of really trying to work with the community to develop a sense of what are the needs and what are the resources in the community to address those needs. Doing focus groups, key stakeholder interviews, working with a cultural, it's called the Cultural Co-op. It's a group that's designated by the Tribal Council to evaluate all programs coming into the community to assure that they're consistent with tribe's values and culture. And as we move forward then, we also use that information to begin tailoring an intervention that we had to pilot. In the second phase, we expanded to see the generalizability of our procedures and our curriculum that we developed, and we tried to look at it more rigorously from a scientific standpoint. And then in the third phase, which we're in currently, we're in the process of disseminating to other tribes. It's been an 11-year process. We're in year 11, which is a rarity in grant funding. It's very unique. Yesterday we trained our 207th tribal member. We've trained folks from 25 tribes and 9 tribal organizations that range from Sitka to the north, to Michigan in the east, to Oregon coast on the south, and to Nia Bay on the west.
Yeah, we have some from New York as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
So basically we started with an assumption, and the assumption is that Native communities know how to deal with issues of concern using their own tribal values and culture. That, as has been pointed out, they are experts on themselves. When we first made a community presentation about this, the wellness director who had invited us in said, you know, we've been doing this work for thousands and thousands of years. It's just that no one ever wrote it down. And part of our job as collaborative researchers is to help write it down. and that's to gain the evidence behind it.
And if I could follow up with that, in my life before I came here to do my MSW, I was writing grants at that time with this wellness director and saw the shift that went from where communities could apply for different federal grants, and you could apply for prevention programs that the community saw fit that would work best in their communities. And then there was this big shift over to evidence-based practices that basically said, you need to find a canned program and use that within your community in order to receive this funding. And I was in a room probably twice the size of both of these, that had hundreds of people in there coming to learn how to apply for this money, and the collective disappointment and shock in hearing that they were going to have to take a different program that they didn't know and understand and impose that on their community was staggering. And it was part of the reason that I went into social work, was because I wanted to look at some of the issues around evidence-based practices, and because it's an expensive and a big time commitment in order to do that. And I wasn't quite sure how to do that. It was a great opportunity for all of us to work together on this and really recognize that the communities are experts on themselves. And, when you're working with an individual client, that client is an expert on themselves, and showing them that respect means that they're going to show that back to you. And you're going to have a collaborative partnership and a connection that makes it so that you guys can move to the next level.
So we believe firmly in evidence-based practice, but we also firmly believe in practice-based evidence. And I think that's part of what we were seeing in the communities. So, as we say, the communities are the experts. They know what it is that needs to be done. They have the experience. They have the indigenous knowledge that, in fact, has led them in corrective paths along the way for centuries. So we really wanted to try to find a way in which we could capitalize and take advantage in a good way of that knowledge, as opposed to some research that had been done in the past where people had tried to capitalize on it in a way that was negative. So we really wanted to do this in the right way. And we also took advantage of the fact that at the same time as we were doing this, there was a tremendous focus within the Salish coastal tribes in particular around cultural resurgence. And it came in the way of the canoe and the canoe journey. And we'll talk more and more about that. So just to give you an idea, we worked with the Suquamish Tribe, which is on Kitsap Peninsula. Robin was raised and grew up there. I live there. And it's located on the Port Madison Reservation across the way. If you go across Bainbridge Island and across the Agate Pass Bridge and turn to the north, you'll come into Suquamish. And if you go a little farther to the north, you'll come to Port Gamble-Sklallam, the second tribe with which we work most intimately in the development and expansion and generalization of our findings. And just to give you an idea of where it is, you can see Seattle in red, and across the water, you can see the two communities with which we worked. And what's of interest and importance and relevance in this is that it's about 10 miles by car from the Suquamish Tribal Center to the Port Gamble Tribal Center, but it's about 29 miles by canoe. I think it was mentioned yesterday it's about a 7-hour paddle. 7-hour pull. I have to correct myself. I'm a kayaker. I paddle. Canoeists pull. So I have to. And the other is you can't use the B word. The B-O-A-T. It's a canoe. It's not a B-O-A-T, because if you say B, you have to go into the water. So I learned. I've learned many lessons in this process. So one of the things that's important is, again, as you look at this, part of what we were trying to do is to use culture and traditions. And one of the things that's important is that when a canoe approaches a community, they come to the shoreline, they raise their paddles, and they ask permission to come ashore. And in many ways, we as researchers have to do that. We don't believe, those of us who have been doing this work don't believe in what's been described as helicopter research, where you fly in, drop down, collect the data, fly off, and never be seen again. Rather, we ask permission to come ashore, and we do so with our paddles up, which is a peaceful gesture. And we hope to be accepted and invited in, and that's really what's happened with us in our tribal community.
And one of the important pieces of this, asking permission to come ashore, has really become a cornerstone of the work that we've done. And yet we didn't come to this phrase and using this metaphor until about 5 to 6 years into it. I watched a friend of mine who is non-native who came in to start working in our tribal high school struggle with this, where he just kind of came in. Somebody said, you should go observe this classroom. So he walked in, said hi to the teacher, and sat in the back like he would observe in a lot of other respects. And it changed the way everything happened in the room. It changed what the students were willing to say. Nobody knew what his intentions were. And I wasn't in that class, but I got an urgent text from my facilitator saying, we got to figure something out. This guy's your friend, but he came in like this. He was told to do this. You know, we met and we're like, oh, he didn't ask permission to come ashore. That's the piece. That's the piece that we all do in a myriad of ways, where we announce what our intentions are when we're going to be somewhere. And it's an important part of our canoe journey because it takes a lot of time. People are sitting out there in these boats, usually in hot weather. And I think you were just saying when you visited Suquamish, it's a steep climb up from the beach, from the shore, all the way up to our community house. And you have to they carry those canoes up there. And it's a whole process. It's, you know, you're announcing that you're coming. Why are you here? You're tired. You want a place to rest. You've heard of our hospitality. And then we invite you up there, and then we're hosting you, which is different because otherwise, you know, if I bring Dennis in and it doesn't turn out well, then as a tribal member who's lived there my whole life, people are going to remember that. Generations from now, they'll be like, remember when Robin brought that guy in from the University of Washington? Oh my gosh, that was awful. And fortunately, that wasn't the issue. So a couple of ways to ask permission to come ashore are things, I mean, Dennis and Lisa and Lizette, who we work with from the UW, were great at coming in and being just support. They were there to help. They would show up at the canoe journey and they would help clear trash. They would pass out sandwiches. They would help elders get food, anything. They weren't the ones who had to be down on the shore welcoming everybody. They didn't make it so that they had to be front and center. They were like, what can we do to support you guys in doing this? And that's the important piece of being an ally.
400 tuna fish sandwiches actually we made and gave out. We subsequently started with granola bars. It was lots easier. So just principles of community-based participatory research, people may be aware of these, but essentially it is to be respectful and do things in consistent partnership. We from the university are not the experts. We came and asked the question, what is the issue that you all have identified and in what way can we be of help and support? And I think that's a very different model of research than is often the case used in other types. But basically to try to use what's culturally relevant to the extent that we can with respect to assessments and interventions, to take advantage of the talent and the expertise that exists in the community. We went through a process which is important in tribal research. We had to get permission from tribal council before we could submit our grant application. We have a community advisory board to which we report on a regular basis. Before we were able to go out and publish anything or present at conferences, professional conferences, it had to be reviewed and approved by the tribal council. Once we have slides that we've used in the past, we can continue to use them. But anything new we need to have approved by the council because, in fact, and the other part was we had to develop a data ownership agreement between the university, who believes all researchers own the data, and tribes which believe that the data is theirs. And we as the researchers in this case had to educate our Office of Sponsored Programs, the Grant and Contracts Office, that in fact we firmly believe the data belongs there. So we have that agreement in place. We actually at one point have a slide in which we show that we have the chairperson and the administrator from the Human Subjects Division that oversees our project out in the canoes with us. So they've we've converted a number of people. And in addition to the basics of community-based participatory research, there are other elements of it that are called tribal participatory research. And it essentially expands and includes a variety of other kinds of things that are important in working between academics and the tribe, some of which I've mentioned here. One of the important ones is the one that says use a cultural facilitator to act as the intermediary. And that's what Lisa Ray Thomas did. And as I said, she was literally and figuratively our go-between, both with respect to where she lived compared to the university and the tribal communities, but also because she was native, herself native Alaskan. And actually now, after having worked with us for about 10 years, is the now current director of the wellness program in Suquamish. So she's graduated to that from our program. Just a model that shows sort of a process of doing research. You know, it really basically talks about the circle and the kinds of things that are important. And if I could see it, I'd read it to you, but I can't. So I'll leave it to you to take a look at that. But just again, that some of what we had was this theoretical model as researchers on the one hand, but the practical applicability issues on the other. So we pulled together the healing of the title is The Healing of the Canoe, Communities Pulling Together. And again, one of the things that's important is I tell bad puns. This one is actually a double entendre of a good nature. And that is that it's the pulling in the canoe, but the communities pull together in a meaningful way around this kind of research. And I think actually Robin came up with that title, yeah. So, and you can see the kinds of things we did. We asked permission to come ashore. We used equitable distribution of resources. So the money for the grant came to the university, but we have subcontracts with Suquamish and with Port Gamble. Robin is the principal investigator of that subcontract, and we have another person in Port Gamble. We hired from within the community. We took advantage of the expertise that was there. So you can see the things that we've done to try to really maintain that. One of which, by the way, is co-authorship. That almost all of our presentations and our papers are co-authored by members from the university as well as from the tribal communities. So the first part of our grant, we had some specific expectations of doing a needs assessment and identifying priorities and trying to develop interventions to address those. And so that's what we did. We did key stakeholder interviews and focus groups. One of my learning experiences was that you don't talk about key informants in communities. Why might that be? What are informants? What is the connotation of the term informant? To me, it's the tattletale, the spy. You know, so the last thing I wanted to do... Nice. You're supposed to say snitch. Snitch, that's it. Yeah, I didn't want to be, dealing with that term. So I was corrected, politely corrected, that these are stakeholders, not snitches. So, but we met with youth, with elders, with leaders or staff members from tribal agencies and from the general community. And we sort of said, what is it you think are issues of concern? What is it you see as the strengths and resources in the community? How could we best address the issues of concern that you've identified? And basically use that information then to develop subsequently, and we'll show you the healing of the canoe or the holding up our youth curriculum. So the kinds of things that we did was we asked a series of questions. We used a semi-structured interview protocol called the Community Readiness Interview. It was developed by a group from Colorado State University, the Triethnic Prevention Research Center. And basically, again, we asked it about behavioral health issues as opposed to more broadly. And we wanted to know what is it that people saw as those issues of concern. And lo and behold, not surprisingly, because that's why we had been asked to come into the community, substance abuse came to the top. But the other thing that we hadn't thought about initially was that especially among the elders, there was a sense that the youth had drifted away from their tribal tradition, values, and culture. And the other message that came with that was that if we were to be successful in addressing the issues of substance abuse, we needed to do it in such a way that brought youth back to that tribal tradition, culture, and value. And so part of what we needed to do was to figure out what is the vehicle, literally and figuratively in our case, with which we could do that. The strengths were seen as the tribal elders, the tribal youth, and the tribes, in this case the Suquamish tribal traditions, values, beliefs, teaching practices, and stories. Again, we learn from our stories. The storytellers are important, and the messages that the storytellers provide is really influential. We also asked about other things besides the main resources, and we found extended family, traditional teachings were important. In addition, we saw that there were other methods that we needed to incorporate into this to try to build a greater sense of community among all of the individuals. One of the things that happened was at the end of this needs assessment, we gave the information to the tribal council. It was given to the grants program so that they could use it to develop further grants, because there were other things identified as issues of concern that could be addressed through grants. Robin is now the director of the grants program for the Suquamish Tribe. And the other is that we sent a flyer summarizing all of the issues, the concerns, the strengths, and the resources to all the members in the tribal community. So they had all of that information. At the same time, as I mentioned, there was this rejuvenation, revitalization of tribal culture in the form of the great canoes. And so as we started to look around, it became increasingly clear that that might serve us as the vehicle in what it was we were trying to do. A quotation from a very well-known First Nations artist up in British Columbia, but basically talking about how it is that the canoe is part of the spirit of the individual in many of the tribal communities, especially along the Salish Sea, and in fact it can be curative. And also, people may be aware of Suquamish being the source of the paddle to Seattle in 1989. And so we thought, once again, there's a reason to look at the canoe. So we saw it, as is mentioned here, from a canoe journey way back in 2003, it seems eons ago, that the journey is an opportunity to teach prevention through our culture. It brings self-esteem and reminds us all of where we have come from. And that's the reason it's important. Once we had sort of decided that we needed to do something that would be culturally relevant and culturally tailored, Robin in particular looked at a variety of different interventions, of prevention interventions that might be available through, like the NREP, the SAMHSA's NREP, which lists promising practices or evidence-based practices, and didn't find a lot, but found this one, which actually was developed here in Seattle in partnership between folks in the Department of Psychology at the time and the Seattle Indian Health Board for an urban set of Indian youth. But what we wanted to do was to have something that would be specific to initially Suquamish. And so we took this as the stepping stone in our platform. It is a skills training approach. It has a series of skills, social skills that really are useful for prevention, such as how do you deal with negative emotions, how do you resist temptation to use, or people trying to twist your arm to use. And we began to look at it as our platform for subsequent adaptation and development. And it was an iterative process. One of the things that was very true is that everything we did was bidirectional. It went back and forth between our research team as well as then our cultural co-op, our community advisory group, and the tribal council, so that We identified through our stakeholder and focus groups what the issues were: youth substance abuse and lack of cultural identity. We began to look at and identify evidence-based practices that could be adapted. We found the one we liked. We presented that to both the Suquamish and the university research teams, and to our community advisory group and to tribal council. And then with a community-based adaptation team, went through each and every session within that initial work group and made it Suquamish.
And we always kind of look at this, whenever we have to do the frameworks, whenever we do the charts, we always have to laugh a little bit because it looks like it's so neat and orderly when really it was like spaghetti all over the place, every different way. We had these amazing groups that would show up to help us adapt the curriculum, make sure that we were on the right path. And there were meetings where we felt like we didn't get a single question that we needed answered. And yet at the next one, everybody was ready to go, and the previous discussion had informed so much of the next process that we're able to jump through 3 chapters and 3 weeks worth of work there towards the end. And so what we really recognized, and what we were glad that the National Institute of Health was also able to recognize, was that developing that trust from the community takes time. Developing the trust among our research team takes time. And that by having that as a solid foundation, we were able to make more progress because of that. And so essentially, once we develop this curriculum, we use the same concepts. We still make sure that there's time, and we'll get to that, but there's time built in to build that trust, because there's not much that we can do without that, especially if we're looking for a long-term solution to something.
So through this process, we sort of distilled, maybe that's not the right word to use around substance use, to distill it, but basically we were able to boil down these things that, in fact, we have a chart, it's not in here, we have a chart with arrows going all over the place, these very fancy sort of concepts and theoretical models and so on and so forth, but actually based on a retreat we had with elders and other community members in which we presented all of that, they sort of scratched their head and said, "What's that?" And we had a one of our youth facilitators, who also was an artist, who took all those ideas and put it into this, which really reflects more fully the blending of both the evidence-based practices from the academic world with the traditions and cultural features that would be important. And what we really like is the bottom, and it really, I think, reflects our belief that the deeper the roots, in this case, the more strongly held the cultural values and traditions, the stronger will be the branches, and that's what grows. And so you can see that there are many things there that really reflect components of an intervention, but it's also done in such a way that it's much more understandable to people, and I think people are able to grasp it much more meaningfully. We came up then with our Holding Up the Youth curriculum. It started off as an 11-session prevention. I'll mention why it started and where it is now. An 11-session intervention plus an honoring ceremony that basically, what we say is, we have sort of a mantra, and that is that the healing of the canoe provides youth the skills they need to navigate through their life's journey without being pulled off course by alcohol or drugs, using tribal values, tradition, and culture both as a compass to guide them and an anchor to ground them. And that's really what it is we've done. We've incorporated skills that are evidence-based, but they're embedded and surrounded by cultural activities, cultural values, and traditions. The reason I say that it started off as an 11 session is that we just recently, with support and funding from the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board, have developed 2 suicide prevention components that are now incorporated into it as well.
And then we've also done a sexual health component as well, depending on what's needed by the group that we're working with at the time. And it's one of the nice parts about the curriculum is that the fundamentals of it work well with a lot of things. One of the examples I like to give is that we had a principal of a school come in and run in right before class started and said, okay, we forgot that it's prom this weekend. Can you guys go in as the health class and tell the kids don't use drugs, don't drink, and don't have sex? And we said, we'll talk to them about prom. And we did it from a very harm reduction standpoint, which is what the community said when we met with them that they wanted. They didn't say harm reduction, but they said they wanted, they felt like the community members are strong enough and smart enough, and that the way we learn is by teaching why you might not want to make this choice. And that's what we did. We talked about it. Prom went off without a hitch. We didn't, we didn't have any teen pregnancies come up from that. We didn't have any car accidents. Those are the things. And, part of our job and part of what we do here, like Dennis mentioned that we had a youth facilitator as well. Part of her job was to tell us when we sounded like annoying adults. She sat there in this room with like Bonnie Duran and Alan Marlett and Dennis and all of these people, and we all felt like we had these great ideas for what youth wanted, and she said, well, what I would hear for that is blah, 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 right? That was like, oh my gosh, thank goodness we have this person here. Thank goodness we have this empowered young teenager who is willing to say those things to us. And that's what we want to get to, right? That's the basis of looking and working with teenagers, is recognizing that they're about to be adults. And so rather than telling them not to do something, teach them how to make the choices. And that's that's one that flows throughout all of the sessions.
And we paid her to tell us those things. So I don't want to go through all of the elements of the curriculum per se, but basically, again, it's a life skills approach. We've adapted it to be specific to the tribal communities. In our current dissemination activities, we actually have a generic template that has all of the life skills still employed, laid out, but there are placeholders for different tribes or tribal agencies with which we work to insert their information to make it theirs and fit. So we, as an example, have used the canoe as our metaphor. We had a group from Oklahoma who came for one of our trainings. They don't see very many seagoing canoes. We had a Metis woman from Canada, sort of the border between Montana and Canada. And she said, seagoing canoe doesn't make sense to us, but our tradition had been tribally that we were Plains Indians and we would hunt buffalo, and we had little red wagons that would be horse-drawn, that we would put the carcass of the buffaloes on which that they had killed to haul them back to their lodging areas. And so the metaphor they used was the journey of the little red wagon. So it's very adaptable. So we've tried to make it, even in our developmental phases, generalizable and adaptable and implementable across different settings. So the skills that we have basically are not uncommon, especially around School of Social Work with Hawkins and Catalano and sort of the risk and preventive components that people often talk about around substance abuse prevention. So we want people to be able to be aware of themselves, to recognize and look at stereotypes that might affect them. How do they get along and get help from the community? How is it they deal with emotions? And you can see a variety of the other pieces that are component parts of what is included as the skill sets within the curriculum. And again, these are some of the people for whom this is developed. The canoe, literally and figuratively, sort of is their vehicle, and it's the tradition. I think one of the ways that Laura Price, our colleague and facilitator in Port Gamble Sklallam, it's the canoe journey moves people along the paths of their heritage and the paths of their culture, and it's really an important process. So I'm not going to go through these. I did go through them. There they were. That's the speed dating approach to prevention. Yeah, we want Rudy to get a chance. So, but just to, again, part of what we tried to do is to put this into a figure that makes good sense, and it shows each of the different intervention sessions or the modules into this diagram that I think is really much more meaningful. So, just to say that we got recognized by a federal agency for the initial community engagement work we did in this project, and then we flipped right into phase 2. So in phase 2, we basically moved to Port Gamble-Sklallam. We evaluated the project, and we found that it seemed to reduce the initiation or the use of alcohol or drugs. It, in fact, did help to bring back youth toward their tribal culture and values, especially those for whom it had not been a particularly strong part to begin with. And more importantly for us, as we talk about issues of suicide, is that we also found that for those who had gone through the curriculum versus those who had not yet gone through it, there was an increase in future hope and optimism, which to us seemed to be the counterpart to the despair and hopelessness that often is found among Native youth that leads to suicide. So that's part of the reason we started to move in that direction. These are our 2 curricula. The Holding Up Our Youth is in Suquamish, the Navigating Life the Sklallam Way, which was developed using this very same process of community engagement, community adaptation, involvement of a community advisory board, is what's used now in Port Gamble-Sklallam. You can look at YouTubes that talk about the canoe journey as a metaphor and what is healing of the canoe. We have a web page that you can get to, and all of that information is available. We're in phase 3, which looks scientific but is like spaghetti as well oftentimes, and that's our dissemination. And as of yesterday, I can tell you that we've now trained 207 attendees from 25 tribes and 9 tribal organizations. The Wordle, people familiar with Wordle? The thing at the top there, that basically you can take a Word document, put it into Wordle, and it will make bigger the words that are most often used. So the larger the word, the greater frequency with which it's been used. So this is at the end of our training. We ask people, so what'd you think? And these are the kinds of responses we get. So this was not from yesterday's, but it was from one a little while ago. So again, we felt that the canoe was a literal and figurative, metaphorical vessel by which we could transmit culture and use it in a preventive and curative way. Our team, this is the one in which we have the chairperson and the administrator from the IRB, the Human Subjects Division, out with us. We had another journey in which they came over and went out with us. I just want to end with this, the pulling together. There are what are called the 10 rules of the canoe, and this is one of them, and it's the pulling together. The journey is what we enjoy. Although the start is exciting and the conclusion gratefully achieved, it is the long, steady process we remember. Being part of the journey requires great preparation. Being done with the journey requires great awareness. Being on the journey, we are much more than ourselves. We are part of the movement of life. We have a destination, and for once our will is pure. Our goal is to go on. And that's what we've been doing for the last 11 years. So, Robin, you want to say any closing words?
I'd just like to say that I'm so glad that discussions like this are going on and that they're being recorded and passed around for people to talk about, because this wasn't here when I was here at the School of Social Work 10 years ago. And if you take nothing else from this, I would say to take that this information we're presenting isn't new, This has been going on in small communities, in tribal communities for thousands of years, the way we're talking about doing this. So it's not new, but it is revolutionary in the world that we live in right now. And it's up to us to keep moving that revolution further, to make sure that we are providing the voice for those who don't often get to have their voices heard.
Good afternoon, everybody. I know you guys have been sitting for a while, so why don't you guys all just stand up for a second? I know I want to stand up. So, you know what you call an Indian with no lips? Pointless. Look at someone close to you and tell them, Lugul am de de kwang. Lugul am de de kwang. What you just said to each other is, you look silly. Hey, I joked. You can be seated. Lugul am de, I'm from the Tsimshian and Haida Nations of Alaska. And Lugul am de is, I wish you the very best day today. I want you to have a great day today. And Degwang is dear friend or loved one, relative. So it's just a greeting that we've always used, just wishing someone that they have a great day today, because it's the only day that we really have. If I can get that. If I was in a tribal setting and stuff, I would go through much more, but this is more of an educational piece, and we're here, and I don't want to drag too many things out, except for the idea that what we're striving to do is make a difference in our communities using the values and the strengths that already exist. The tools to make a difference are already there. So we want to try and just take it and use that as we move forward. I've used this presentation in a couple different conferences, and it's really, I've always talked about the idea of when I engage and I try and lead workshops and stuff, is that I really try and get away from having tables and barriers in between me and the people that I'm sitting with. Is that in the evidence-based program that I'm here to kind of talk about, aggression replacement training, we always talk about having tables between us and the youth, especially in the detention centers or within the institutions and stuff. They said because if they get too excited, if they get too angry, they get too upset, we want to have something in between us. We don't want to be wrestling with kids. I say, I want nothing between us, because I want to be able to have access to them. I want to be able to hug them, put my hand on them when they are having a hard time. I want to have that free access to them. So there is some differences between the tribal adaptations and the structured programs of evidence-based, which have been well researched in different big cities and urban settings and stuff. So just talking about the idea of us sitting in a circle so that we can share, put all of our concerns into the middle, and then help each other to carry them and lift them. I think before we even moved forward with the idea of what I work for juvenile rehabilitation was the recognition in that I've been working with troubled youth for 26 years. I'm a recovering alcoholic and drug addict myself. I grew up with a lot of abuse and violence in my neighborhood. I'm from a small fishing village in Alaska. And I've seen this, I've lived this. So watching all of the destruction, watching all of the violence, going and burying my cousins and my friends and relatives, I've been to too many sad gatherings and ceremonies, was gathered around the loss and destruction. So it's like, how can we make this change? How can we address this? And the reality is that even in JR is that when you look at the percentages of youth, Native youth, American Indian, Alaska Native youth that are in the general population, it's less than 2%. And I can tell you is that I went through and I added up the numbers 3 months ago. I went through every institution of the secure facilities in Washington State, juvenile rehabilitation. The population in the juvenile secure facilities was 11% American Indian, Alaska Native, tribal affiliated. How is it that the entire population that's recognized as tribal affiliated is 1.9%, and the youth inside the institutions is over 11%? there's something wrong. And that's why I'm here. Is I've lived it and there's something better and I've found it. And it's in our songs, it's in our culture. Does anybody know the answer to those questions? How many federally recognized tribes are there in Washington, or in the United States, or in Washington? 566? Right on. How about in Washington State? There's 29. So there's 566 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And what's interesting is that when you say American Indians, if you're simply born American Indian in America, as a youth, you are moderate to high risk simply by being born with your tribal affiliation. It's a pretty startling fact. Simply being born an American Indian in America, you're moderate to high risk for early death, incarceration, suicide, abuse, poverty. More of our children are dead before they're ever born. More of our infants are dying before they ever reach 1 year old. Dropouts. These situations are just facts of the American Indian contextual state. And many of these things that we talk about today, we're sitting here because of each one of these horrible statistics that's affecting our children. I'm here because it's like I say, I'm Uncle Rudy. I'm committed to this because of who I am, because of the honor and the responsibility given to me being a Native man and father. So outside of my job, I would do this no matter what, because it's who I am. But I'm thankful that I have the opportunity to try and address this and be a part of a system that I see as being a part of the driver for some of these things, so that we can address and try and change the outcomes. Oh, went the wrong way. The medicine wheel has 4 parts: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Being able to tap into all 4 of those elements so that we can really try and find a way of providing wellness, going from being survivors to thriving. And that can only be found when we truly start to address within our communities the lack, the loss, what was done, within the government systems of the boarding schools when they took. And people don't want to talk about and say, well, yeah, there was some trauma and stuff. Well, historical trauma means that they took, and my mother was one of them. My grandparents were taken to the boarding schools where they said, kill the Indian, save the child. They was pretty effective at destroying culture and instituting and teaching violence and then introducing alcohol. So then people returned to their villages and they didn't have the cultural understanding. They didn't know the relationships. They couldn't speak the language. They didn't know the ceremonies. They didn't know the seasons. They didn't know the Aboriginal, the subsistence way of life any longer. But they did learn how to hit their kids. And then they're surprised that there's a lot of violence in Native communities now. Why are you surprised? You introduced it. You taught it. So all these negative statistics that I've talked about are really outcomes. And outcomes that I say is the outcomes when our culture, our values, our teachings, our stories were taken away. So if these things didn't exist prior to this introduction of a modern, civilized lifestyle, how can we gain that wellness, that thriving again? How can we find that wellness, that whole medicine wheel of understanding and being able to truly not just hold on to our kids, but watch them fulfill their dreams, watch them grow and become strong and proud and have that laughter again when we have our culture back. If anyone has children, they better teach their children to follow the traditions that we're leaving behind. Because it is later than we think with all that is going on. I know who I am, and I'm thankful for that. And I'm trying to instill that in my children. I love going out and pulling on the canoes. I've laughed with some of the best times I've had with my children. I've got pictures of me and my children out on the canoes. And it's like us throwing each other in and jumping in and watching some of these young folks. It's like you see them downtown at the mall or something, and they've got the big baggy shirt on and their pants are kind of hanging down, and they got on the earbuds and they're kind of like listening to some rap. And then you see them out on journey, and they're standing in their full regalia, and they're standing taller. And they got their headpieces on, and they take out their drums and they start to sing, and then you see them opening the doors for elders and going and getting food and feeding their elders and playing with their little brothers and sisters. You see the things that they're starting to really be proud of, and it was found in their culture. How can we take that and build upon it? And the one thing that I've always predicated all of my work on, and I really appreciate the idea that you say we ask for permission, is I have always said, I can't, but we can. I can't teach your children what it means to be Suquamish. I can't teach your children what it means to be Nisqually. I can't teach them the values, the traditions, the language, who their relations are, if they're of the Tlingit, or if they're of the Killer Whale clan. But we can, together. Only together can this happen. Only together can we make a difference and really start to thrive, built upon the cultural understandings and values of the communities, the parents, the children. They are the experts. I really appreciate the idea that this didn't exist before. These are outcomes now. How can we change it? By looking back to the teachings of our elders. That's where it's going to happen. There's some more quotes. These are elders' quotations. So, one of the things that I wanted to say is that as I worked in juvenile rehabilitation, I worked in the maximum security institutions. I worked in the prisons. I watched what was being done. And I've seen the outcomes and how the kids were being treated and stuff. Is that I said there's got to be a way that we can take what we already know works, what has already helped, supported, and helped to change our youth, and use that to be the catalyst for change. So then we began to do weave-in. We began to do the dream catchers. We began to sing the songs. We began to birth the drums within the institution. And then when I transferred out to parole, they said, well, we really want to try and use evidence-based programs. It's a requirement. The CJA grant monies, Community Juvenile Accountability Act. The legislature requires us to spend money on evidence-based programs. It has to be evidence-based, otherwise we can't fund it. And I said, well, do you have evidence that has worked with American Indians? Well, we've never delineated the information down to a point where we can really specify the demographics. It's like blah, 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 right? I said, so you're telling me that you don't have any specific information that works with American Indians, Alaska Natives? Have you ever used it on a reservation or in a fishing village in Alaska? First Nations community? Well, no, we've never. Then how do you know it's evidence-based if you've never got any information, you don't have any numbers, and you've never used it in the communities with which you are promoting it to be evidence-based? How about we begin to give them these tools, just like when they gave the Comanche horses. They was able to take the Spanish horses and do things that even the guys with saddles couldn't do. And they was doing it on barebacks. Why? Because they became experts. They took it and invented ways of doing things better. They created a relationship. They made those horses part of who they were. Same thing with carving, the Haida people. Tremendous carvers. Then when they got iron and steel, the level of carving just went up an entire next level. I say, well, how about let's take the evidence-based program, aggression replacement training, that it has CBT, cognitive-based therapy, pro-social skills, effective communication, anger control training. How about let's work with them and help them teach them better control? How to deal with disappointment, frustration, high anxiety, love, and moral reasoning. Because when we put those three things together, you have long-term change. The piece that was missing was the cultural adaptations to meet the needs of the community and match the identity of the community in which they are trying to put it on. So my work has always been to try and take our culture, our traditions, our songs, our pace, the manner in which we speak. I always joke. Let's make all of that a piece, components that we can add on to the CBT, aggression replacement training. And that can only be done when we use tribal people, tribal staff, people who were raised in that community. When we have them, we have the knowledge, the expertise, and the relationship. And we have to make sure that we get the thumbs up. We have to get the approval of the elders. Because we have no right to go into anyone's family and say, we're here to fix your kids. Especially as government entities. That's the worst thing you can say in Indian country. I'm here from the government. I'm here to help. The door slams. I say is that with the aggression replacement training, I can remember when I first went out and they was talking about, oh, well, we send out notices. We send them an email. It's like, what? I went out and they was having a community dinner. And I kind of stood on the side and I was just telling my jokes to people and stuff like that. And they said, aren't you going to eat? I said, well, they saw, you can't turn down when they offer you food. It's never say no. Never. So I said, oh, yeah, I'd love to eat. So I jumped in line. I sit there and I'm joking and I go through and I eat. And then it's like afterwards, I grab a broom and I start sweeping. And then somebody says, hey, he goes, who are you? I said, I'm Rudy. I said, what's your name? We joked and talked like that, and I kept sweeping. Then I'm picking up garbage, and we're cleaning the tables. And he said, what are you doing? He said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Alaska. And he says, well, what are you doing here? I said, I work for juvenile rehabilitation, and I'm trying to figure out who to talk to about evidence-based programs in the community. He said, you should go talk to Kevin. I said, what's your name? He said, Darren. I said, well, where do I find Kevin? So how did I get in there? I went in there and I started sweeping the floors, picking up garbage, putting away chairs, and simply trying to create a relationship and asking for permission to go in and even share the invitation. And then once that began, I said, the next thing we've got to do is we've got to go to the community, we've got to talk to the parents, we've got to talk to your council, we've got to talk to all your different systems, and I need to go and visit your elders. So I went to the Elder Center and I asked them for permission. Once I got that permission, then we began to try and educate the community about evidence-based programs. It was a struggle, but it was a beautiful thing to be a part of. And only through a true commitment to loving them, caring about them, and being willing to put yourself in a position of being a servant, will you be able to really develop a partnership with people who have been treated so horribly for thousands of years, or actually hundreds of years. So, just to back up what you've said, go in there, ask permission, be a servant, ask them because they are the experts, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
So I think the time was really well spent just hearing the expertise and the stories of the panel here. Technically, I think this lecture is not now over, but if there's folks that want to stick around and ask questions, I'm not sure what your guys' time is. We have a few minutes for that, but those who need to leave, we understand you need to leave. Maybe we just thank them one more time for a really great job.